HTML helpers are a feature that's more specific to coldbox and not always found in other MVC frameworks. It doesn't have anything to do with the MVC part of coldbox. HTML helpers are part of extra functionality that coldbox provides. They work kind of like this. You use HTML helpers to write consistent HTML output, and they help cut down on some of the boilerplate parts of HTML. For instance, with HTML helper, you can just specify a name attribute, and coldbox will generate both the name and ID attributes for you. You can see an example of that in the code snippet here in the HTML helper documentation. Here's the HTML helper line of code, line 2, and you can see I'm just calling html.button, passing in a button name and a value for that button. And below it on line 5 is the output that function will create for you. It's making a button tag, and I'm getting both the name and ID attributes set to search view for us, whereas we only specified the name argument when I called html.button in the original code. It also automatically added type equals button for us, and of course it put view on the text output for that button itself. So you save about 30% of the characters on this. You have a little bit less typing to do with the HTML helper option. It also guarantees that you have name and ID attributes set to the exact same value, so it'll cut down on typos in that kind of situation when you're writing both of them out by hand in your forms. And it also guarantees that the way you build this button will be the same way you build all buttons in your entire coldbox application. As long as you're using html.button, they will all be generated with the same consistent markup as the output. Button is a good example to use here because you might know we can use the button tag to create a button. We can also use the input tag and pass it type equals button. You might have a larger application where some forms are using type equals button on the input tag and some other places in your application are using the actual button tag like we have here. It can get a little bit of confusing the larger your application grows, especially if you have something like, let's say, jQuery or CSS that you want to use to style all buttons in your application. If you've got some that are done with a button tag and some that are done with the input tag, you end up with several different situations you have to account for in your JavaScript or CSS. And using something like the HTML helper just cuts down on those inconsistencies in your applications. Let's take that a step farther and look at the HTML helper in an actual form for more than just the button tag. Here I've got the form for our users details page that we've seen in some of the previous videos. Here it is outputted to the screen. I'll refresh it so you can see that it's working the same way as you've seen it work in previous videos. And back here in details.cfm is our code. I'm just going to close that down so we can see the entire form. Here we go. Here I've got the form tag just like we had previously. And you'll notice that I've got commented out input tags and label tags through most of the form. These are the older versions of code that we had in the previous demos. And below each of them, I've got the HTML helper equivalent of that line of code. So here we've got an input tag for the hidden field for user ID. And here I'm using the HTML helper input field function, type equals hidden, just passing in the user ID name property and the value for it. You can see in our original code, I also had to specify the ID. That gets done automatically for me with the helper. You can also use it for things like label tags, html.label, pass in the field that I want to provide a label for, and then the content, which is the same as the text that appears between the label tags. And you can see I'm just sort of alternating between using html.input field and html.label, just like I would alternate between using the label tag and the input tags for the more traditional HTML style output for a page in my application. I'll go back here to the browser. You can see, of course, when I do view page source, it outputs the code the way you expect it to output. It's actually outputting our HTML inputs and label tags. And you can see the page works just like it does in previous demos as well. I'll change George's name to George2, hit save, and there's George2, and I'll change it back. So this doesn't do anything different to the functionality of your web application. It just gives you a more consistent API when building the HTML layer of your application. There's basically an HTML helper method for every HTML tag you'd use. Some of them are named the same as the HTML element, like button or label. Others aren't named the same, but the names make it obvious what they're for: anchor, input field, image button, and so on. Like any other methods, they have attributes you pass in to turn different options on and off. If you add attributes that aren't part of the HTML helper function itself, they just get passed through to the HTML that's rendered to the screen. So if you've got data attributes you want to add to your HTML, just add them and they'll get rendered out how you expect them to be rendered out. Here's the code we were looking at a minute ago. I've reformatted this HTML input field just so we can see the arguments being passed in here a little bit more clearly. See, I've got type, name, and value. When I go back here to the output of our web page, I can right-click on, that is our first name field, right-click and inspect, and you can see there's our first name label, and there's our first name input tag. If I go back over here to the input field, I'll go ahead and add class equals my form control. Save it, go back here and reload the page. And when we inspect that element again, you can see here in the output, input class equals my form control is being outputted to the screen. If we go here to the API documentation for that input field function, you'll see that class is not listed among the parameters that that method takes in. So this is a good example of what we talked about a minute ago, where if you pass in different attributes here into this input field, and they're not actually being used by the function itself, they will just get passed on to the output HTML that gets rendered to your browser. So you can do things like add class attributes. If you have other attributes that are just not the names of whatever these parameters are that you know need to be part of your output. For instance, with the input tag, we could use tab index as well. You'll notice tab index is not listed here, and that might be something you want to include in your input fields for accessibility reasons. I could simply go in here and do tab index equals, let's say, 1 to start. Go back here to my browser, reload, and there's tab index equals 1. This will work for any HTML attribute that you know needs to be added to that, in this case, input tag, but I can do the same thing for the label tag from html.label or any of the other methods inside the HTML helper set of functionality from coldbox. A complete list of the HTML helper methods is available in the API docs at apidocs.orasolutions.com. You simply go to that URL in the browser, type HTML in here on the left, and click on HTML helper. There's all of the documentation that you need. In addition to the methods for creating the HTML elements, you'll also find some helper methods that assist with creating your HTML, but don't necessarily translate directly to an HTML tag like the ones that we've looked at so far. We've got things like make pretty for formatting your HTML, objects to table, which makes a table from an array of objects, cutting down on the repetitive boilerplate table markup that's always a giant pain to do in applications. You've also got query to table, which does the same thing, but with rows from a database query. There are several other helper methods that really can cut down on the boilerplate work in creating your views, and they all come from this HTML helper set of functionality. You can read more about all of those methods here in the API documentation. And a nice thing about these HTML helpers is they're turned on by default, but they are definitely not required in your application. So if you still like writing HTML by hand, which is totally fine, you can completely do that in your code, and it works exactly how you expect it to. Maybe just dip into the HTML helpers for things like creating tables or query data when it would save you some time. You can mix and match between plain HTML and the helper functions as much as you'd like. Coldbox will convert all of the HTML helper stuff to proper output for you automatically when your views are rendered as your Coldbox application is run by the browser. There's no limit to how many functions you can call. There's no speed difference really in calling the HTML helper methods versus typing the HTML out by hand. It all gets compiled and processed on the server, and then of course turned into Java bytecode the same as any other code in your application does. So there's no real performance problems to worry about there. You just get a nice consistent API for the view layer of your application when you use it.